Good morning. I'm very glad to share with you today. I have the opportunity to speak this morning. Kevin's out of town, and so I have the privilege of sharing today. And the subject I'd like to share is something extremely near and dear to my heart. I've been working on this message for years, to be honest, and so it'll probably take a long, long time to get through. No, I did my best to summarize it, and I called Kevin last night, and I was like, this is getting too long. There's so much here. It's like if you've traveled abroad or something, or just traveled anywhere fun, you want to go everywhere. Then you're like, oh, I'm going to England. I might as well go to France, Germany, and Russia as well, since I'm over there. So I had to consolidate and find what was the core message for today. So that's why I'm going to use, this works, actually. Is that me? Let's go back. That's him. I have a laser pointer here. This is part one, and I don't know when the rest of the parts will come, but that just was a way to appease myself, saying there's more to come. I focused on one key idea here. We're going to read and explore the idea of the fullness of time. The verse in Galatians, the NIV, I think, said when the time had fully come. The ESV and King James, I believe, says the fullness of time. That Christ came in the fullness of time. And the reason this subject is so near and dear to my heart is because I get to teach this along with some of my friends and colleagues that have actually joined us here today. And in a moment, I'd like to introduce some of them. They're sitting over there. We get to teach this at Boise Classical Academy that meets here in the church. And we're using this idea of the fullness of time to guide us as we explore our subjects. Okay, classical Christian. What we teach at Boise Classical Academy is the classical Christian tradition. And for those that may not be familiar with that, it simply means that we use Christianity to understand history, philosophy, science, literature, and it's a lens, it's a perspective. It's saying, how can we use Christ to interpret these subjects? And so the term classical simply means exploring the great classics of all history, of all civilization. And so we go back to the very earliest texts ever written. This is the Epic of Gilgamesh and so forth. And we'll study all the way to the present day, in which we read Mark Twain. But we're doing it from a Christian perspective. And so today I'd like to use this perspective for us to understand history and what's the meaning of history, especially. And I'm going to use the Lion King to help us do that, because the classical Christian perspective can use any medium and explore the truths, the human situation. Okay, all of us are made in the image of God, and we all have the same challenges and struggles in life. And therefore, we can look into even non-Christian literature, for example, and see that there's still human struggles there. Now, one way to understand that is they may not have the answers in those books, but they have a lot of the questions. Does that make sense? Like, you're going to see somebody who jumps off a cliff is going to have, see the results of gravity. Like, gravity will be displayed there. The Lion King, though, I don't know if there's Christians that helped write that, but there's some fascinating themes that I think will help us explore this subject of the fullness of time. So this is a guiding theme for us, for our school, Boise Classical Academy. Here's some of our students at the school, and look at that handsome fellow. I'd like to briefly introduce just some of the people that work with us at Boise Classical. We have the Divany family. If you guys just want to wave, they're a very bright family that have joined us today. They get a hand. Their son likes to carve sharp things, he told me. That's Chris. Can you wave, Chris? He's going to be TAing for us. He's a college student. Next to him is Abra. Can you wave? She's helping with admin and TAing. We have the Hancocks, Lori and Roger. They are, Lori's kind of like the mother of our school, and it's, a lot of homeschool kids come there. She raised 4 homeschoolers herself. And they've all become extremely successful. So we're just very thankful for that Christian homeschool guidance. Her daughter teaches literature for us, and that's Manna Hancock. And you can hold your applause for her. And then Derek Ryrie is a good friend of mine, and he teaches philosophy and history as well. And Derek, you want to say hi? Some of you know him already. So this is a team. I have to also point out Mr. Steve Huffman. He has served with us and taught apologetics and science, and so he did that last year with us, and he might do some apologetics for us. So I was hoping that this congregation and the school can have opportunities to have fellowship, because we're part of the kingdom together, and I think this would just be mutually beneficial. So I'm going to go ahead and jump in, though, to this story of the fullness of time. In Galatians 4:4, it says, when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son. When I read those words as a younger person, I thought a lot about what that meant. What does it mean at a certain point in time? Why? Why did Jesus come when he came? Now, this is important for understanding the history of the world, but think about it this way too. Jesus at one point entered into your life. On an individual level, Jesus came at the fullness of time in your own personal life. Does that make sense? Like, as a young person, maybe you didn't have a relationship with Christ, and at one point he came and you came to know Christ. So I like to explore things from the personal, individual level, and then zoom out and see it on a historical level, so that at some point in time it was considered the right time for Jesus to come. And I want to understand what that means. Why is there a right time? There's thousands of years, thousands, before he came, going all the way back to creation. But for some reason, it was deemed that, bam, that's the perfect time, 0 AD. For those of you not familiar with the dates of history, it was about 0 that he was born. And for some reason, that was when God knew, in his infinite understanding, that it was perfect. And I'll come back to that term, perfect. But that's exactly what it was. It was the perfect time. Have you guys ever thought, why didn't God send Jesus to Adam and Eve? Like, Adam bites the apple, and then poof, Jesus appears, and then it was like, oh, just, wow, the gospel message came right then and there. Why wait thousands and thousands of years? Has anyone thought about that? I have. I was like, that could have saved maybe a lot of confusion or trouble. But there's an important reason that he didn't, and this is the message of today, is that God has a purpose and a plan. There's a reason that the fullness came when at 0 and not thousands of years before that. And it's partly because of the context of his message. He says in Galatians 4 that he's speaking about an heir. If you guys remember the scripture reading that we just heard, it says that an heir, H-E-I-R, during the time while he was still underage or still a child, is treated like a slave under a guardian. But in the fullness of time, he gets to come into his inheritance. The fullness of time is about coming into an inheritance. That's the gospel. But you can't do it until you've come of age. There's a period that's going to require us to grow up. Until that period comes, we are under guardians and managers. And I'm going to explain what that means. Well, actually, Jesus can explain what that means. Imagine the prodigal son. He was an heir. He had a great inheritance waiting for him. And he decided, I'm not going to wait until the right time. I'm going to do it before the time while I'm still immature. And what happened there? Squandered it. I used color coding to help. He squandered that and ended up eating out of pigsties. Literally. He wasted his inheritance. Why was that inappropriate for him to do? It was his inheritance, right? Didn't he have a right to take that? Well, yes and no. If he could have had faith and patience, then it would have been best. But instead it says here that he did this as a disobedient son. The beauty of this is he gets to come back and be reconciled. But Jesus teaches us about the heir here, that immaturity is the great obstacle. Immaturity is an obstacle for us to experience our inheritance. All the verses that speak about immaturity seem to be one of the major themes of the New Testament. To contrast that, though, the fullness of time means maturity. And I'm going to try to teach a couple Greek words here that are of vital importance. Telos, T-E-L-O-S, it derives from a Greek word which means completion, perfection. Okay, here we see fully grown, full of age. It's one of my favorite Greek words. It's something that has become what it was always meant to be. Okay, so imagine like a little seed one day is meant to be a tree blossoming with fruit, okay? Like all of us. We start off as these little tots, and then one day we will grow into who we are meant to be in our fullness. Okay, so that's the word maturity, or telos. And to help illustrate for some of the younger here, when we see somebody coming of age, we see that at first it's kind of an awkward development. I mean, look at this, that mane. That mane is very lacking, okay? It's coming in scraggly and patchy, and not until the final age can Simba's mane be nice and fluffy. We see in the movie Lion King that Simba goes through this process of maturity. It's a theme of the movie. One of the best definitions for it, as you can see here, is that as we grow into maturity, it's a spiritual journey. So I would like to suggest that all of history is in fact a spiritual journey of coming to maturity. And that's what the fullness of time means. It's reaching the goal, the planned goal. Even in the very definition, it says having that full age. Let's look at this theme, though, of the full age, the mature age, and contrast it over and over again with the theme of immaturity. Or, to use a translation, it means childish. We can be childish or we can be mature. When the perfect, there's that key word there that we just looked at, you could also translate that mature. In fact, some of your translations might actually say mature there. When the mature comes, the partial passes away. When I was a child, I spoke like a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child. But when you become a man, you grow up, okay? You begin to understand, you begin to know fully. Paul's trying to contrast the childishness versus maturity. In 1 Corinthians 14:20, he goes, stop thinking like children. In regards to evil, be infants. He's talking about innocence there. But in your thinking, be mature. Okay, if you guys have seen the movie, Simba is very childish. He goes off into the dangerous elephant graveyard, and he's not supposed to go there. But because of his immaturity, he doesn't have good boundaries. In Ephesians, we see that exact same word contrasted with childishness again. He says, and this is part of the theme that is in the bulletin, it says, the unity of faith brings us to mature manhood, brings us to completion. He contrasts that with being children who are tossed to and fro by the waves and carried about by false doctrines. So the whole world, Paul's speaking to an individual, but if we understand this as a message for the whole world coming into this fullness, that everything before Christ, by comparison, is a childish age, an immature state in which the world's not ready for its inheritance. Finally, he says this. He says, before you were dull of hearing, you were in bondage to these basic principles. That Greek word literally means elementary. It's like, picture an adult in elementary school. Has anyone seen Billy Madison? That's kind of not quite the most appropriate movie. But it's about a full-grown man who has to go back and repeat elementary school because he failed out of it. And, of course, it is a very humiliating experience, or it should be, but he's into it and he likes having lunch and all that stuff. But he's acting like a child. Well, he says don't go back to literally elementary principles. A full-grown adult that still has to eat milk instead of solid food. Everyone who lives on milk is unskilled in the word of righteousness since he is a child. Solid food is for the mature, for those who have their powers of discernment trained by constant practice. This is a call to all of us to say, let's grow up. Be mature now. Let's get over the basic stuff. He's talking about the basic stuff of Christianity, by the way. Let's go to the mature stuff and become leaders. He says by this time you should actually be leaders. Okay? But we're still acting like children. All right, so that's a little setup to contrast the immaturity with maturity. Right before the passage of fullness of time, Paul says, before faith came, we were held under guard, having been restricted by the law until the coming faith would be revealed. So if we're in a state of immaturity, we are under law, we are under bondage of the law. And I think the best analogy for this is understanding the rules and restrictions a little child would have. Bedtime. If you're a little kid, what time is bedtime for your kids, like little ones? 8 o'clock? Okay, that's pretty early. Okay, 8 o'clock. Think about this. A child needs to be told to go to bed at 8 o'clock. Why? So they get sleep. Okay, why do you need sleep? Okay, so you can function in school, unlike a lot of college students who don't sleep. Exactly. Now think about the principle there. We want you to function well. Okay, we want you to be healthy, function well. What we need to say, therefore, is be in bed by 8 o'clock. Little kids are like, it's like 8:01 and they like dip their toe outside the door and like, oh, I'm breaking the law. Does that really matter in the grand scheme of things? Well, as long as they get sleep, it's okay. But because of their immature minds, no offense, little kids, but I'm just having to contrast this, your minds can't conceive of the importance of sleep. How healthy and vital that is. And so parents, as your guardians, need to tell you, get in bed. And ditto with food. You need to eat your bananas and carrots. And what else do you feed your kids? Squash. I don't know what healthy kids eat. Now this might sound like a little bit of, I'm not trying to undermine the exalted state of the law in one sense, but I am trying to say that compared to what the gospel is, the law is like having a babysitter and all these rules. Now imagine our analogy. You're a full-grown adult, and your friends call and say, hey, do you want to come to the opera tonight or theater? You're like, oh no, man, my bedtime's 8 o'clock, and I got to be in bed if I can't stick my foot out the door. You're like, you're 30. You can't go to the opera? It's like, I'll get a big spanking if I go out. That would be very embarrassing and humiliating. Paul's writing to people that are still thinking that way, immature in their minds, and they're following a lot of the customs of the old times that were meant to protect them in their immature state. And he goes, wake up. The fullness of time has come. You have come of age. You're grown up now. So before this period, we were under the law, and this is a very powerful message here. What Paul says is, in this very passage, that we are as heirs, as children. We're no different from a slave, though, when we're little kids. Why? Because we're under these guardians that tell us what to do. And when Simba's a little cub, the bird, what's the bird's name? Zazu has to tell him, don't go to the elephant graveyard. He has to guard him. And so Simba's under the control. He doesn't have a lot of freedom. He's going to be the king one day, but he has to listen to this little bird man. So this is a period of bondage. This is how we should perceive the law. We were under bondage. It was for our own good. The law is a great thing, but it takes away our freedom. The protective role of the law is emphasized by Paul's use of the word here, and I just love this Greek, so please let me indulge here. The word for the guardian is pedagogue. Has anyone ever heard of that word in English usage? Pedagogue? Go ahead. Very good. And if you study education, that's called pedagogy, I believe. The pedagogue now is meant as a teacher. Back then, I think the best translation was literally a babysitter, someone who has to, give you your applesauce and milk and spankings. Is that what babysitters do? The pedagogue is like a zazu that makes sure you don't get into trouble. That's the main goal. Provides discipline. It literally would provide the rod and beat you if you did bad things for your own good. And so Paul's trying to get us to wake up and saying, if you want to live under the law and live under all these rules, you can do that, but you're acting like a kid. If you want to follow Christ, that's the opportunity to grow up. And so, of course, we see here Zazu pushing him away, and then Simba can't really do what he wants, okay? Well, this gets to one more term, and this is a term that I am going to use to help guide the school at Boise Classical. Pedagogue actually comes from the word paideia. Now, paideia is an extremely rich word, and it means a lot of things. It can mean the culture or education or even discipline here. And so what the babysitter does or the guardian does is provide paideia. This is training, okay? Being trained up in the right way. And so maybe let's extend the analogy to an athlete now. Instead of it just being like little kid rules, an athlete has to abide by a very strict schedule, like these Olympians, to attain their goal. They have to follow these very strict rules to gain their health. So paideia could mean instruction that trains somebody to reach full development, to reach maturity. All of us have to go through some sort of paideia to come of age. A child under development with strict training so that they can reach their full potential, their full development. Okay? So paideia could mean discipline. Let's use that word right now because discipline actually means teaching. Like a disciple is a student. A discipline is the teaching they receive. In fact, in Hebrews it simply says that we should be disciplined by the Lord. The Lord He disciplines those whom He loves. And as we sang in that last song wonderfully, as sons and daughters, we ought to be disciplined by the Lord. If we weren't disciplined, it would simply mean the Lord didn't love us. Well, Rafiki loves Simba, and so he's going to discipline him. He beats him over the head at one point, and Simba's like, why are you doing this? And Rafiki says, oh yes, the past can hurt, but the way I see it, you can either run from it or learn from it. Okay, that was my best Rafiki voice. He's the pedagogue here, to use our Greek term. He's the guardian. He beats him, disciplines him, that's the rod, and he's teaching Simba to learn from the past here. Why? Because Simba needs to grow up. He's being a big baby by eating all the bugs with the pig guy in the jungle. Okay? It's time to get past eating all the bugs, that's baby food, and go eat some hyenas or something. That's coming of age, or a gazelle. And so through Simba's instruction, he can come of age, and of course, I love that scene, though. You guys have seen Lion King, okay? This is when they're walking over the log, and they're just, like, growing up, okay? Montage. And here's the point of maturity. This is what I'm trying to build up to. We become mature when we can answer this question. Who are you? We're asking that to ourselves. Who am I? And if your first response is, oh, I'm Ben. Okay, that's just a label, that's just a name. Like, what's my identity? Who am I? Your maturity begins when you can answer this question with the truth and come to know, this is what Rafiki asked him, who are you? And what's the answer for Simba? Who is he? He's the king. He's the son of Mufasa, and he has to look in the water, and he gets that revelation. He goes, oh my gosh, I'm the king's son. I'm Mufasa's son. I'd forgotten that. I like a prodigal son, I'd gone away and squandered a lot of this, but now he's brought to maturity. When the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his son. Why? It's to wake us up. It's like, it's the gospel message of Christ. And understanding that Christ is the Son of God is that we get to enter into a relationship with God through him. That we might be received as adoption as sons. And because we're sons and daughters, the Spirit of Christ, the Spirit of his Son, comes into our hearts. And we can cry out, Abba, Father. He's our daddy now. We're not little kids anymore like slaves. We get to step up into our inheritance, which is the gospel, which is the kingdom. The kingdom is the gospel of Christ. And we step into the kingdom when we wake up and realize who we are. If we are a son, then an heir. Not just as Christ the heirs, but we are heirs. And if we want to grow up, we get to answer that question and identify who we really are. So coming of age and fullness of time, to me, are the same thing. One we use to talk about us individually, like at your bar mitzvah or something, or your sweet 16. We have all these rites of passage. And in some sense, the entire world had its coming of age, its rite of passage when Christ came. And God called us and said, okay, now I want you to come forth no longer as these little kids, but as my sons and daughters. Here's the scene in which Mufasa appears in the clouds and says, you've forgotten me. That was part of the great sin of Simba, is ignorance. He fell and became deluded about who he was. And he looks into the water, and it turns into Mufasa. And then he can finally be empowered and says, oh, I'm the son. Now I can go fight Scar, which is probably Satan, I think, in the movie. And now he gets to be the king, an heir to the jungle lands where he lives, to Bright Rock. So we're simply using this as an illustration, but for us to try to take that on, and this is challenging even for myself doing this study, is it's very comfortable to see Christ and acknowledge him as king. Amen, he is the king. But then to suddenly say, and we are co-heirs with him, that's where it gets uncomfortable. That's where we have to step it up and say, okay, are we ready for solid food? Because that's the real gospel message, is that we're the co-heirs and that we're brothers and sisters with Christ. We call Abba, God the Father, together. Both Jesus and we both call him our Father. To do that means to take on a lot of responsibility, and that's why many don't. In some sense, it's a lot easier to have your mom make you the peanut butter jelly sandwiches for the rest of your life. It's very, very tempting to me, to be honest, to have that. But there comes a day, that's not very solid. That's quite mushy. And if I'm going to grow up and take on what the gospel is really claiming to me to be, that I'm going to be an heir, then I have to have a complete transformation of mind. We're called to be transformed by the renewing of our minds and have a Christ mindset. So we'll conclude by answering this question for ourselves. Who are you? And a lot of stuff's going to come up. Your identity is based upon your family and your demographics, where you're from, what you look like. But we're not mature until we can answer this question in terms of who he is. And he's our Father. It's almost scary to come at him, to God as our Father, because of the intimacy and the directness that implies. To stand before God would, as Moses found out, we'd die if we were directly in his presence right now in this present state, although one day we can do this through Christ. In fact, we're called to do that through Christ's, what's the word I'm looking for? Through him, we can approach the Father. It says, you are sons. God has sent the Spirit of his Son from our hearts, crying, Abba, Father. Well, here when Mufasa says to Simba, everything the light touches is our kingdom, let's not forget that the gospel that Jesus is going out and proclaiming is the kingdom of heaven is at hand. There is an inheritance here that we're joining into, and it's a kingdom. So the fullness of time is the maturity of age. God prepared the world for the coming of Christ through the law, like Zazu. The whole Old Testament then is about being prepared under that pedagogue. Through the discipline, that's the paideia, we receive instruction that trains us up. It grows us. It's good for us. Sometimes it's hard. Sometimes discipline hurts, as we found out with David. Those who were in the Bible study this morning saw how brutal discipline can be. But ultimately, it was good for David's soul. It humbled him and helped him to become a man of God. And so finally, maturity, becoming a full age in the fullness of time, that's the lens by which we're going to teach many of the students at our school to understand history. Say that's the real meaning of history, is Christ is the very center point there. That's the fullness. When he came, he said, this is his own words, now the time is fulfilled. The kingdom of God is at hand. Those two go together. It's inheritance into the kingdom, and we're called to get to join in that kingdom, not merely as subjects, but as co-heirs, as brothers to Christ, as sons and daughters of God. Well, this is only the part one for a lot of reasons, because now we can actually go through the history and see what that means, to be matured and to look at that. And I think that part of this study could be to grow up then. Let us leave the elementary doctrine and go on to maturity now. With a perspective like this, when you read the scriptures, everything changes, and it's a fascinating change. We'll go on and see that the whole Old Testament becomes this period of maturation, this period of growth. I think the covenants is key to that. And so part two, whether I get to teach that here or wherever I teach that, I'm developing one to show how the covenants is them growing up in the different stages and coming to know who the Christ is and the Messiah is. And then another big part that we're going to study this year, which a lot of people in the church don't have the opportunity to study as often, is the preparation of the Gentiles. That just as the Jews were being prepared for their fullness of time, the Gentiles were being prepared. Because Paul is very explicit. He's saying that when the world was ripe, Christ came for all believers. And he's Jew and Gentile. And this is where it gets trickier and where I think it gets quite interesting to try to understand this. How did God prepare the Gentiles? When I say Gentiles, I'm talking about the Persians and Greeks and Romans, oh my. Like, we're talking about this whole background to the Jews. The Jews absolutely have a special position in history. They bear the oracles of God, he says. That's the covenants. But the Gentiles were being prepared as well. And so when Christ came, it's not a coincidence that the Gospels are all written in Greek. Do you think that if God was going to have his entire New Testament expressed in a language, he might want to prepare that language to receive it? Think about what that means. You're preparing a language to receive all the spirituality you're going to pour into it. Okay, so unless the language is ready to receive it, it can't be expressed in a language. That's just one example of some of the ideas that we're going to explore. So I hope that this was able to communicate how amazing God's plan is, that what is true for all of history and all of civilization is also true for our individual life, that we were prepared to receive Christ when he came into our life, in the same way the world's was prepared to receive Christ when he became manifest and began his ministry in 30 AD. So I'm going to close there, and I know that was a lot of info, and hopefully that stimulated you and encourages you to want to push, to explore deeper, to go into the solid food, if you haven't already. Let's close in prayer. Lord, we thank you for the opportunity to come together each week and devote this time to worshiping you and praising you and studying your scriptures and encouraging one another. Lord, I pray that as we come to study these scriptures, Lord, that they can point us to you and point us to the relationship that we are called to have with you, Lord. And in one sense, none of this is new for us that are believers, Lord. But in another sense, Lord, I know that as with any relationship, we can always go deeper and that we can always grow closer to you, Lord. And so I pray right now for this congregation, Lord, that none of us have apathy. And I pray, Lord, that you can dispel any lethargy, spiritual laziness in us, Lord. And that we can be hungry, Lord, to come and approach you as our Abba, as our Father, and explore what it means to be an heir along with Christ, and that we can look to him as our King, but also as our elder brother. And Lord, for those that this is new, Lord, I pray that you can help them understand and open their eyes to this amazing gospel that is the kingdom. And Lord, for those that have had a chance to grow into maturity, Lord, I pray that they can step up and be leaders, Lord. You said by now you should be teachers. And there's many here, Lord, that I know have that gift. Sometimes we think of that so formally as having a classroom or something. But Lord, a teacher simply means one who leads. To educate literally means to lead and show the way. So Lord, I pray right now for those who, even as I pray this prayer, their hearts stir, Lord, to say that they want to step up and lead. Lord, this congregation right now is at the point of asking many to step forward in the next few months. Lord, I know that many will step forward and serve this church by leading into maturity. Lord, for those who aren't sure, I pray that you give them boldness and faith to come and grow into that maturity that you have called them, Lord. Because ultimately, Lord, the gospel is that we get to become who you've always meant us to be.